Back in 2015, I had just finished my internships at Amazon and Facebook and was about to join Amazon for a full-time software engineering role. Many of my peers at the time, understanding how bad of a student I was, wanted tips from me on how to land these big tech internships because, well, if somebody with a 2.3 GPA can do it, then they should be able to do it as well. So that eventually led to me giving a talk titled How to Get a Job at the Big Four, which has been viewed over 1 million times to date. But that was 5 years ago, and 5 years in tech is a really long time. I mean, back then, not everyone knew about Gail McDowell's book, Cracking the Coding Interview. Not everyone knew about the website LeetCode, which is a wonderful resource to practice your algorithm questions. And so, over the last 5 years, I've had exchanges with people from around the world, whether it's on LinkedIn or via email, about that video. And more recently, a common question I've been getting is the material presented in the How to Get a Job at the Big Four talk still relevant today? And so, that's kind of what I want to discuss today in this video. You can think of it as How to Get a Job at the Big Four Point 1. So the material in this video is meant to be an addendum to the original Big Four talk. And we'll kind of go over what I was right about, what I was wrong about, and the things that have changed over the last 5 years. So if you haven't already watched that video, I recommend you do that first. I'll link it in the video description as well. So first off, what is the Big Four? Well, in this case, we're talking about the Big Four tech firms here. Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. And people will often ask, well, what about Apple? What about Netflix? And another really common term that people use is FANG, which does add Apple and replaces Microsoft or Netflix. The reason I don't use the term FANG is because Netflix only hires senior engineers. And so if you're a new grad or an intern, you're not going to be applying to Netflix. And I feel like those are the kind of people that are most likely to be watching these types of videos. But I hope people don't get too caught up in the term. I mean, Apple is obviously an excellent tech company. If you can get a job there or an internship there, I mean, obviously you should go there. You know, Salesforce is an excellent tech company. So is Intel or IBM. Like, if you can get a job or an internship at any of these big tech companies, I think you should take that opportunity, unless you have the privilege of debating between multiple of them. Okay, so regardless of what you call it, whether it's FANG or Big Four, the point here is that we're talking about large tech companies. And then people will often ask me, well, you know, what about the startups? And yes, I mean, working at a startup has its own perks. But when you're an intern, when you're a new grad especially, I think there are things about large companies that you should really take into consideration when you're trying to decide which company to go to when you're just starting out your career. The first reason being the brand recognition. You know, when you work at one of these companies, it opens so many doors for you in the future. Putting down a top tech company on your resume is basically a stamp on it that says you're at least this good. And yes, there are companies, in my opinion, that are higher in terms of compensation or prestige. For example, the pre-IPO startups or the quant trading firms. But Amazon, Google, Facebook, you know, these are household names that even your parents would recognize. And more importantly, the recruiters will recognize. The next thing to consider is compensation. And I think there are two layers to this. The first is the raw dollar amounts. And this is as simple as, well, the large companies tend to pay more. That's it. There are exceptions to this, like Valve and quant trading firms. But yes, generally, large companies tend to pay more. But suppose that the compensation, in terms of the dollar amount, is approximately the same. Then you have to take in consideration of the compensation structure. And so let's say, for this example, take Google and Airbnb, for instance. Google, a very prestigious and large, publicly owned tech company, and Airbnb, a very prestigious and large, privately owned tech company. The difference here that you need to think about is the compensation structure. And when you're just graduating as a student, and you have student loans to pay off, presumably, the restricted stock units of a publicly traded company is going to be more valuable to you than the privately owned company's stock options. And I mean, I guess that depends on your risk tolerance, and there is a lot of upside to Airbnb stock options, I'm sure. But I mean, look what happened to them this year. They were talking about IPO for many months or years now, and then this COVID-19 thing happened. Their valuation got cut in half. So, when you're just graduating and you want a strong foundation to start off, you want stable finances, I would say that going with the Google option, the large publicly owned tech company option, is a safer route. Finally, when it comes to deciding between these big tech companies and startups, the last thing to consider would be logistics. And, because these big tech companies are global, chances are you are living close to one of their offices already. To be fair, you most likely will have to move somewhere on the West Coast, probably, some greater Seattle area or Silicon Valley. But if you do have to move, they're going to provide you a temp housing or a relocation bonus, or sometimes both. And as a Canadian, this is a big one for me. As a foreigner that's not native to the United States, it really helps when you have a massive company backing you up with credibility and immigration attorneys, more importantly. And so I think all of this makes it a very practical launching pad for jumpstarting your career. So if I made a convincing case, then the next obvious question is, well, how do you get a job at a big tech firm? And again, that is the main meat of my previous talk, so I'm going to try to refrain from repeating myself in this video. However, one claim I've made in the past is that the big tech companies are easier to get into than the smaller ones, which I now believe is only half true. I mean, the thing is, yes, these companies, they have unquestionably one of the most rigorous and judicious hiring practices, but it's just that they're all consistently hard, and their consistency plays out to the candidate's favor in a lot of different ways. These companies, they all have their own slight differences, their own nuances, Facebook to Google, Microsoft to Amazon, but for the most part, they all do hire in the exact same way. And so it is a game, and it's something you can learn to play and get good at with some practice. And this game really only has two stages. Stage one is get an interview somehow, which is going to be a combination of having an interesting portfolio of your work, having decent grades, having a refined resume, having the right connections. And then stage two, and I know it does sound a little silly hearing it, but it is true, you just have to do well in the interview. And the thing is, you know exactly what to expect on these interviews because you have so much data points. It's just going to be a number of whiteboard coding sessions and system design questions, and that's it. Now contrast that to interviewing at a smaller company, startups. There's less data points out there, so sometimes you have no idea what to expect. And so that's what I mean by the large companies are easier to get into than the smaller ones. Their consistency plays out to the candidate's favor in a lot of ways. But if I was to point out an error from my old talk, it would be not emphasizing the importance of culture fit. Now, for internship positions specifically, since there's usually only 2 phone interviews, it is true that maybe there isn't enough time to do an explicit behavioral questions focused interview. Although I suppose it could be the first or last 5 to 10 minutes of each session. But that was it. And this is a changing trend in the industry. I think companies are starting to care a lot more about culture fit now. Now, for example, Google's on-site loop used to be 5 technical sessions, some combination of whiteboard coding and system design. And the culture fit part only came into the picture once you pass the hiring committee, because then, yeah, you'll talk to the hiring managers about the team culture and how you would fit into it and all that. But that was it. And more recently, what they've done is they've actually made one of those 5 sessions of the on-site interview loop to be a completely behavioral questions focused interview. Another example is Microsoft. Now, I don't know how long they've been doing this. It does seem like it started within the last 2.5 years of me working there. But Microsoft now conducts interviews in a manner where each interviewer is assigned a core competency to test the candidate on. And one of those core competency might be something like collaboration, or it might be something like adaptability. And so they're going to ask you behavioral questions to help you demonstrate those qualities. And Amazon as well, they've always had this thing called their leadership principles, and they've always asked candidates on how they demonstrate those principles at their work. Facebook, they've always had this thing called a Jedi interview, which is, basically another culture fit / behavioral interview. So now I think it's safe to say that culture fit is a very important, if not the most important part of all on-site loops. And I think this is a positive trend in the industry. I think this is a good thing. And here's my reason why. Even if someone is a brilliant engineer, if hiring that person is going to hinder the synergy of the team, then the net effect of hiring that person is still going to be detrimental. As an interviewer myself, I've overlooked holes in the candidate's technological understanding in the past. But I've never overlooked the candidate's tendency to, let's say, get stubborn or be confrontational or lie in interviews. Why? Well, a smart person can fill the gaps in their understanding pretty quickly. They can learn and adapt. But a person's character? Yeah, that's really difficult to change. But despite its importance, the good news here is that culture fit isn't something that you necessarily have to spend hours and hours trying to perfect. Because yes, obviously do spend the time getting really good at answering the behavioral questions that are really common, like tell me about your strengths and weaknesses, or tell me about a time you resolved a disagreement. But I don't think you really want to fake your personality to get a job. Or maybe you do. Really it's up to you. But, that kind of deception probably manifests itself in pretty pathological ways pretty soon after you start working. So I think the thing to keep in mind is that bad culture fit doesn't necessarily mean that you're objectively a bad candidate. It just means that the current members of that particular team and yourself will not get along for whatever reason. And I think that's fine, right? That's fine. I don't get along with everyone at work. And part of being a team player is acknowledging your disagreements and working it out over time as you start working. So I think the best thing to do is prepare for all the common behavioral questions and then bring the best and most honest version of yourself, and you'll be fine as long as you aren't a complete. The last thing I wanted to address from my previous talk is the actual preparation of the interview and the resources you're going to use to do that. Now, in the past, I recommended the book called Programming Interview Exposed. I actually don't think this is a valuable resource for anyone who's had a CS education anymore, because it's going to explore topics that you should already understand at too great of a depth. So if I had to pick one book, it would still be Cracking the Coding Interview by Gail McDowell. Now, it explores common interview topics at a very reasonable and sufficient depth, but the nice thing about it is that it's organized in high-level concepts so that you can figure out which area you're weak in. Like, for example, let's say you're amazing at search problems, but you really need to practice dynamic programming questions. The book is organized in high-level concepts like that, so you can dive in and just practice those. Now, let's say you've gone through all of the questions on Cracking the Coding Interview and you're still looking for more. Well, if I had to pick one website for you to practice on, it would be LeetCode.com. Now, it's a website that lets you code in any language you want, and they'll automatically run their test cases against your code to see that it worked. They have over 1,300 algorithm challenges on there, many of which have solutions and explanations so that you can verify that your solutions were optimal. One thing to keep in mind though, I don't think LeetCode replaces doing mock interviews on a whiteboard with a real person. And there are a few reasons for this. The first of which is that LeetCode will actually set up all the method signatures for you. Now, an important step during whiteboarding in a real interview is asking the questions to the interviewer to clarify what the input and output should be and whether or not they need to be sanitized in some way. LeetCode actually sets up all the method signatures for you, and they usually only have valid input, so you're never going to get the opportunity to practice that important skill. And the other reason, and I think this is the more important one, keep in mind that the goal of these interviews is to understand the candidate's thought process, not the candidate's ability to get to the right answer eventually. You know, LeetCode is not going to time box you into 45 minutes to an hour. It's not going to collaborate with you. It's not going to give you hints when you get stuck or redirect you when you're going down completely the wrong path. Ultimately, LeetCode will only test your ability to get to the optimal solution eventually, and not your ability to communicate and evolve. So if you practice in a vacuum by yourself, without getting any feedback, it doesn't matter if you've done 1,000 LeetCode questions if you're practicing it incorrectly. So I say get a friend or a colleague to help you out and take turns practicing on each other. Those are the main things I wanted to elaborate on my original How to Get a Job at the Big Four talk. I think that video is still highly relevant today, and I hope it's a valuable resource to you. If you have any questions or comments about any of the things I discussed in this video or that previous talk, maybe you wanted me to discuss how to practice more effectively, or maybe you disagree with the pursuit of careers at big tech companies, I'm happy to have that discourse in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.